commissioners that we know are able to participate today in the meeting.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Larson. Are we recording now?
Yes, we are.
Okay, well, let's get started. Ms. Larson, can you please conduct the roll call?
Yes. Commissioner Boygan.
Here.
Commissioner Eaton.
Here.
Commissioner Gibbs. Chair Gibbs.
Here.
Commissioner Hahn.
Here.
Commissioner Hopkins.
Here.
Commissioner Jolan. Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Overture. Commissioner Overture, I believe you're still on mute.
Here. It looks like I'm unmuted. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Putnam.
Here. Good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Chair, you have 8 out of 9 commissioners present.
Great. Thank you much, Ms. Larson. Before we move to the staff report, I believe Commissioner Hopkins has something for everyone.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman Gibbs. I'd like to share some information briefly with my fellow commissioners and the staff. Want to let folks know that on last Thursday, myself and Mr. Davenport had a Zoom conference call with some of the Logic stakeholders, and we discussed a couple of items. One is the April 28th letter from the environmental and community health organizations, which Logic was one of the primary authors of. And I was interested in getting a better understanding of why they sent the letter and what their goals and objectives were for the meeting. And goals and objectives were from the letter, and the 6 specific requests in the letter. And we talked about that. Secondly, we also discussed a couple of upcoming rulemakings. The first one was the wellbore integrity rulemaking and a review that they provided me of their previously filed comments with the commission on that particular rulemaking. And second, discussed the mission change rulemaking, and they just shared some important concerns and issues that they'll be addressing as part of that rulemaking. And I just wanted to make sure folks were aware. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner Hopkins. Let's move now to the staff report, and this is a report to the Commission on COGCC's readiness to address recent developments in the oil and gas industry. So, Director Robbins, I believe the floor is yours for you and your staff.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairman Gibbs. Give me a moment to figure out how to take the floor. Miss Larson, can you help me? I need to share my screen.
Yes, Director Robbins, you should have down the capability to share your screen. It should be at the bottom of your page at the screen.
Okay, hold on. I'm working through it. Did that just happen?
It did indeed.
Yep.
Ha!
Success.
Amazing. Let me see. From beginning. Okay, here we go. So commissioners, thank you for your time this morning. We've set aside just a brief hearing this morning to provide some input and update with regard to the COGCC and its operations during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the drop in commodity prices and kind of where things are with oil and gas in the state of Colorado. I want you to be aware that this morning we posted 2 documents to our website. And Ms. Larson, are those available at the homepage?
They are. They've been posted on the announcements.
Great. So those 2 documents, one is what we're calling the Readiness Whitepaper. It's about 9 pages. It is a narrative document that attempts to address some of the questions and concerns that we heard from you and that we've heard from others that have lodged questions with the Commission over the course of these intervening weeks. And then we also put together a companion piece that is the 2020 Readiness Whitepaper FAQ, or frequently asked questions. I and staff are going to go over both, or in particular, the Readiness Whitepaper today with this PowerPoint, and feel free to ask questions as we go through this document. It's our attempt to show how it is that the Commission is ready and able to accomplish its statutory duties during these times. I want to point out to folks that these documents, as with pretty much most documents that have been posted during my tenure as director, are fluid documents. This is our initial attempt to address questions that we've received from folks that are interested in what the Commission is doing. We did not take public input into these documents ahead of posting them today, but that does not mean that we're adverse to having public input about the documents themselves and what's contained within them. And I always am ready, willing, and able to listen to folks about what we're doing here at the Commission on all topics, and that includes the topics that are addressed in the white paper, as well as the white paper frequently asked questions. A second sort of clarifying point that I would make is that with regard in particular to the frequently asked questions, many of them are, I put quotes around the question, and that means it's actually an identified question or a version of a question that we actually have received over the course of the last several weeks, relevant to the work we're doing during COVID-19, as well as the work we're doing during the downturn in commodity prices. And so we attempted to post the questions and then post answers to questions that we've received. So again, the purpose of the paper is to review and communicate that the Commission is ready, willing, and able, and it is able to undertake its statutory duties during this time of COVID-19, as well as the drop in commodity prices. The next slide or two is an overview of what I'm going to provide to you along with my staff. We're also going to provide a current active well numbers. I'm going to have Dave Andrews and my engineering manager, and Mike Leonard, our field inspection manager, help explain some of the engineering standards relevant to some of the things that we may be seeing as we move forward. There are 4 different categories of areas in which a well is not producing for whatever reasons that may exist. These are the 4 categories: shut-in wells, temporarily abandoned wells, plugged-in abandoned wells, and drilled but not completed wells. And we're going to explain to you and to our stakeholders the distinctions between these types of well activity and how they remain safe during the times that we're in right now. So that's another part of the overview. We also will provide an explanation of our field inspection and our environmental protection specialist units and the work that they're continuing to be able to do now. We're going to get a little bit of a presentation into sort of the outlook on where we see industry at this point. And then finally, I'll provide some perspective about some compliance deadline relief measures and some other measures that we've instituted at the Commission in order to ensure that operators are able to operate during COVID-19, but we're also making sure that all of that is happening in a manner that's protective and safe and safe as to health, safety, welfare of the environment and wildlife resources. So that's an overview of the presentation this morning. Again, we're hoping to take 20-30 minutes here and then take questions. So back to kind of the overarching goal. The Commission is organized such that neither the pandemic or the industry downturn has at this point, and it's not expected in the future to represent any significant impediment to safe operations by the Commission. There are 3 sort of key points to this. One is that key inspection personnel are deployed across the state, and they're equipped to access information from home offices and mobile devices. Number 2, the operational information that is gathered by operators and by our inspectors and Others in the field, it's all uploaded and maintained in a digital format, which provides the inspection staff with ready remote access. And they're able to continue to do that work even from a safer from home order that we're all continuing to abide by. In addition to our field inspection experts, the commission is composed of teams of engineers, geologists, environmental and reclamation specialists, and enforcement professionals who regulate the industry. I've said any number of times that I came to the commission almost a year and a half ago, and I have been extremely impressed with the scientific knowledge and experience and dedication of the professionals that are the Oil and Gas Commission. And while those professionals are all still working from a safer from home perspective, with limited work at our Chancery building in Lincoln, it's amazing what I'm able to see and what I see as I see these teams accomplish their goals. I wanted to let the commissioners know that one of the things that I've instituted over the course of the last several weeks is I've been dropping in on manager meetings with their supervisors. And so I met with the engineering team, and then I met with the GIS team and the permitting team and the OGLA team. And it's impressive, indeed very impressive, that these folks are able to continue the work that they're doing from their remote locations. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the COGCC is really well equipped digitally to be able to undertake the continued work from home. So the third sort of perspective of why we're ready is that the regulatory structure of the commission ensures that these professionals are able to continue their critical regulatory functions irrespective of economic, social, or health emergencies. And that's just, again, sort of backing into where our team are able to get their jobs done. It's impressive. Here are the well status. Hey, hold on just a sec. There, now I can see my whole screen. So you can see active wells from 2019 to 2020 and shut-in wells from 2019 to 2020 and temporarily abandoned wells from 2019 to 2020. The active wells have maintained a similar status. They've gone down by a bit. Shut-in wells are down actually in the month of March by about 550, and temporarily abandoned wells in the month of March are up by 600 or 500 or so. And we'll have April numbers here shortly. And again, commissioners, as I'm talking through this, if you have questions, feel free to ask. So Mike Leonard, as I mentioned, is our acting field operations manager, and Dave Andrews is our engineering manager. In the Readiness white paper, we go into the engineering standards that establish how it is that what we're able to do maintains safety. This is on pages 4, 5, and 6 of the paper. And Mike or Dave, I'm putting you on the spot here, but if one of you could sort of walk through these different categories of wells that we might see and sort of explain first the definition of shut-in well or temporarily abandoned well, and then explain what sort of protocol exists around that activity, and then explain the oversight of the commission on these types of things. These are the areas in which we've received questions from stakeholders about whether there are concerns or not. And I'd like to have you guys provide some perspective about that. So can I have one of you guys step up and start to talk about these 4 categories? Oh, come on, I told you I was going to do this. So can one of you step up?
They just need to be unmuted. Give me one moment and I'll unmute them.
Oh, good.
Mr. Leonard is unmuted at this point.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Robbins. Yeah, in the categories of wells, the shut-in wells, again, it's a pretty simple, straightforward process where the operator goes out and closes the valves on the wellheads to shut in the well. And there's various reasons to shut in wells. Not just because of economics. Wells are shut in on a regular basis, even during the good times, if you will. Reservoir pressures have to build up. Some wells are shut in. There's various reasons. Maybe line pressures are high and they have to build back pressure for the gas wells. But again, numerous reasons why wells are shut in. Temporarily abandoned wells, that's where the well is incapable of production in its current state. So some piece of equipment has been removed that won't allow a well to produce. And a lot of the temporarily abandoned wells right now are wells that are in the process probably of being plugged. There's a lot of vertical wells in the DJ Basin that will be plugged because of the horizontal wells that are being put in place or will be put in place. Temporarily abandoned wells are required to have an MIT performed within 30 days of, or a mechanical integrity test, I'm sorry if I use acronyms, are required to have the MIT mechanical integrity test done within 30 days, which requires a plug being set above the producing formation. So in addition to closing the valves at the wellhead, there's an additional plug. The plugged and abandoned, that's exactly what it is. They're plugged to state standards. Engineers, and Dave can talk about this a little bit, the engineers have a process in which they receive a notice to plug or a plugging intent to plug, and they verify that that's going to adequately plug the wells. And then the last drilled but not completed wells, or DUCs, DUCs as we call them. These are wells that have been drilled to depth, have been cased and cemented, so they're sealed off, but they haven't been perforated and fracture stimulated.
So,
Dave, go ahead.
Mr. Leonard or Mr. Andrews, can you talk a little bit about the process or the reporting requirements around each of these categories? And then if I could have one of you also speak to the things that occur that ensure safety when these sorts of things are happening. Hannah, can you unmute Mr. Andrews as well, and they can sort of tag team answering this?
Absolutely. I believe Dave is currently unmuted, so go ahead and try talking and we'll see what happens, Dave.
All right, thank you, Director Robbins. Just to supplement a few things that Mike said about the different categories of wells, in the white paper, I believe we had an analogy of a garden hose. So I just kind of wanted to walk through that in layman's terms. And I would start actually down at the bottom for the drilled but not completed wells. So let's say you're building a new house and the water company puts in the water line, but right now you don't have a valve to turn anything on. So that would be like a drilled but not completed well. So then the plumber comes in, installs the plumbing in your house. You have a faucet on the outside of your house now, but you don't have a hose yet. So that would be similar to a temporarily abandoned well, because you don't, you have the infrastructure in place, but you don't have anything hooked up to water your lawn yet. Then we move to shut-in wells. That's an example where you have everything hooked up on your house, you've got your garden hose going, you've got your sprinkler in place, but you have not opened the valve yet. So there is no flow. And then finally, plugged and abandoned wells would be you're tearing down a house, removing all the infrastructure, and you no longer have a water supply. So hopefully that helps kind of walking through that discussion. As far as reporting requirements, operators are required to report monthly on their report of operations. So that would list all the wells that an operator has and what the status is for those wells. So some of the status codes are shut in, temporarily abandoned, or plugged and abandoned. The other common one would be producing. As far as some of these particular scenarios, for both shut-in wells and temporarily abandoned wells, operators are required after a certain period of time to submit a Form 21, which is a mechanical integrity test report. Mike mentioned MITs as he was running through those. For a shut-in well, if it's been shut in for 2 years, then an MIT is required. And for a temporarily abandoned well, in that case, since the well cannot readily produce, we want the information much quicker. So that is required within 30 days. And then finally, we have plugged and abandoned wells. So many wells have been drilled in the state. Many are plugged and abandoned. So those were essentially depleted oil and gas production, and they are plugged out. For drilled but not completed wells, those would show up on the operator's report of monthly operations. Then backing up a little bit, plugged and abandoned wells, we have what's called a Form 6 well abandonment report. So that's required. A plan is required before they plug a well, and a subsequent report of activities is required after the work is done. And then finally, Form 4s are required for temporarily abandoned wells. Those are sundry notices annually to keep it in that status.
And Mr. Andrews, the white paper goes on to follow up on some of the stuff that you just mentioned relative to the fact that the commission is generally, with regard to these different categories of wells, is learning of this somewhat after the fact with the report that is filed. Why is that the case, and why is it that our standards do not have field teams or environmental protection teams reviewing this activity? If you could sort of answer that question as is answered in the white paper. I think that's a question folks have asked us.
So, I mean, as part of routine operations, and Mike might be able to speak more to this, but we have reports that go out to our field staff daily as far as being able to prioritize their workload. When wells fall into either shut-in or temporarily abandoned status, that may give our local inspectors clues to maybe incorporate that in their weekly round. So Mike can talk about priorities as far as having the ability to let's say go out and inspect a well when it is put back on production. That was actually a new rule that was added during the flowline rulemaking earlier this year. So really, the next time operators return wells to production, we will have that opportunity more so than we have in the past.
And what happens, Mr. Andrews, we had a question about the potential, which we're not seeing at this point, but the potential for an operator to just be insolvent and have no ability to, put a well into one of these categories. What's the commission's response in that extraordinary instance? I mean, we have the ability to take over and move in, right?
Yes, so our immediate concern is public safety. So we would go in if we are aware that an operator is unable to perform their requirements for producing these wells. We often hear that through our field inspectors, through pumpers out in the field that work for these operators. First thing that usually happens is the staff might not get paid, and our inspectors might learn about that. So that's another reason why we might be looking closer at certain operations. So at that point, if we make a determination that the operator can no longer operate their wells, if it's bankruptcy or whatever the case may be, the commission may issue a cease and desist order where we would go in, shut the wells or shut in the wells, make sure all of the equipment is de-energized, and the next step would be really the whole enforcement and bond claim process, and ultimately the orphan well program.
Mr. Leonard, do you have anything to add?
Sure. And Mr. Andrews is correct. The field inspection group does get kind of a heads up at times through talking to the field personnel, through news reports, things like that. And we will look at those operators a little bit closer. As Dave said, you know, if COGCC has to go in and shut the wells in, we will. It's important to note that, again, as I said, wells are shut in on a regular basis. Operators do it. It's a very safe procedure. They'll shut the wells in. They'll de-energize their equipment at times, especially if it's going to be an extended shut-in. It's an industry practice. And as far as temporarily abandoned wells, typically the equipment's removed to a point. And again, the plugs are set, the valves are closed. And we do witness a lot of those mechanical integrity tests that occur on the temporarily abandoned wells as well. At a minimum, if we don't witness them, the operator has to produce chart documentation of the test, and there's certain parameters that must meet as well.
And finally, Mr. Andrews, if I could turn back to you, you contributed to the white paper in terms of putting perspective in that the whole process, the drilling, the completion, the producing, the shut-in, that's a sort of a holistic process, each of which is done to your engineering standards to be safe. Can you speak a little bit to that? That these categories of wells are part and parcel of production, just like production is part and parcel of wells.
Sure. I mean, thank you, Director Robbins. The key point with any well is the design standards are such that it needs to be able to withstand the pressures, flows, conditions that are expected throughout the life of the well. So when the well is originally designed and constructed, you know, they have that in mind, that at some point during the life of the well, it may be temporarily abandoned, or you know, depending on the reservoir pressure, maybe it has to be shut in periodically in order to build up that pressure for production again. So, you know, really all of this is built into the original design of the well. And then also I thought I'd point out a couple of other items. We have a Form 42 field notice, and again, Mike may be able to talk more about that, but anytime an operator is doing, you know, different parts of their operations, our rules do require that a Form 42 be submitted, and the purpose of that form is to notify our inspection staff so that they have the ability to witness operations. And then last, I thought I'd point out that under our financial assurance rules, we have an inactive well review that occurs a few times a year. And after a well has had no production or injection after 12 months, that triggers that review. So even before we get to the point of a 2-year MIT for shut-in wells, we are already looking at inactive well financial assurance to make sure we have that in place.
Excellent, great. And I can't see all commissioners, but if commissioners have questions for our scientific experts, you know, now might be a good time, or I can continue with the presentation and we can take questions at the end. Ms. Larson, do you sense, should I just move forward?
I don't see any commissioners seeking to ask questions. Yeah, and commissioners do have the ability to unmute themselves. So if you do wish to take advantage of that option, you may unmute yourself and ask a question at this time as well.
I'll continue forward and then we can take questions. These guys will be around. Mike, I might have you speak next to the inspection activity. If you could sort of speak to inspection activities from last year versus this year and what you're seeing. And I might also invite Mr. Duranolo, our environmental manager, if he wants to speak to the environmental protection specialist and the activity that they are able to see as well. But Mr. Leonard, maybe if you could go first here.
Sure. This table does show the inspection activity over first 4 months of 2019 and 2020. And as you can see, we're actually up on inspections. I think a lot of that has to do with better weather. I think we had some pretty severe weather in 2019, especially going into the later months. But it does show that the downturn or COVID-19 has not slowed our inspection staff, because they are remote. They're out in their own vehicles from their home offices, still looking at everything out there. One other thing I'd like to note as to temporarily abandoned and shut-in wells, they don't receive any less scrutiny for inspections than a producing well. So we're still looking at those as well. The notices of spud, which is for those that don't know, it's the beginning of the drilling of a well, and then the notice of fracture stimulation. That's some of the notices Dave had mentioned that field inspectors get. As soon as the operator puts it in, it goes to that field inspector for that area, so that they can have a chance to witness that spud or that cementing of that surface casing, and witnessing of the fracture stimulation. Up until, well, it's been down a little bit throughout 2020 for various reasons. There has been a market downturn. There was a severe market downturn, obviously, early in March, but there already had been a downturn. And the notice of plugging operations, these are wells, majority of these wells are wells that are being plugged, vertical wells being plugged in lieu of the horizontals going in. The severe
Speak a little bit
drop-
about that, Mike. Could you explain a little further?
Sure. So when in the DJ Basin, when horizontal wells are drilled in the Niobrara Codell Formation, there's already vertical Niobrara Codell wells in the area. The Codell was found in the mid 80s. Niobrara Codell was found in the mid 80s and has been drilled vertically for that period of time. They want to plug those vertical wells in so that they can produce, so they can fracture stimulate and produce the horizontal wells, and they need to plug the vertical wells. Couple reasons: they're not economical, and secondly, they're also a potential conduit to surface, so they plug those wells out. In April, we're down to 4 rigs in the state, I believe, and so they're not drilling as many horizontals due to market downturn and the COVID virus. I do know of one operator that just recently shut down all of their plugging operations for at least 2 weeks because they're quarantining their crews. They had a couple crews that tested positive for COVID-19. So that's why you're seeing the downturn in the notice of plugging operations for April as opposed to last year.
Mr. Duranolo, do you want to add anything from an environmental protection specialist perspective in terms of how things are going there?
Sure. I just thank you, Greg Duranolo, Environmental Manager. I'd just add that for the environmental staff, we've got 12 environmental protection specialists also located, out of home offices throughout the state. We do have 3 of those environmental protection specialists that are normally stationed in the Denver office, and now they're also operating out of their home offices, which puts them, out in the areas in which the wells they oversee exist. So 2 supervisors, 1 on the east, 1 on the west, and on average, our staff's got over 20 years environmental consulting experience and oil and gas regulatory experience. We've had a couple recent additions, and we also have to our staff, and we also have a 20-year veteran on our staff. So broad range of staff responding to environmental situations. So responsibilities are to implement the CDPHE water quality control, groundwater standards and classifications. We respond to spills and investigation and remediation oversight. In this situation, our spill reporting requirements for new spills has not been relaxed or lessened. All reportable spills need to be timely reported, and all spills, whether they're reportable or not, are required to be cleaned up. Our staff conducts approximately 50 inspections a month, just pulling numbers off of our dashboard for the last couple of months. In February, there were about 46, January, there were 46 spills, new spills reported. In February, there were 53, and in March, again, about 51. So those numbers track pretty consistently with the prior year.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Arnold. I appreciate that. Just moving through the rest of the presentation here, commissioners, I wanted to sort of point out that as of the end of 2019, there were approximately 52,000 wells among 421 operators. Interesting fact, 40 operators control approximately 47%. So 10% of the active operators control 90% of the active wells. This white paper process has allowed me and staff to ensure that our monitoring efforts remain adequate. This was sort of a gut check for us, and I'm pleased to say that we've got this stuff in place during COVID-19 and during the commodity price downturn. And I think you can hear from our experts that they're able to continue the work that is necessary to ensure protection of health, safety, welfare of the environment and wildlife resources during this time frame. Had some questions about other states that potentially looked at their oil and gas regulatory body, having authority to control price or production. That's not something that we have authority to do. We do have authority to, but in the what do we have? We do have authority to order an operator to shut in a well if the well cannot be operated in a manner that's protective of health, safety, welfare of the environment, and wildlife resources. We've not had to execute on that authority, but it does exist at this point. Finally, we had operators, legislators, and even the governor's office wondering if there was anything that the commission could do to ease compliance measures in response to COVID-19 and reduce access to office-based resources and in the safer from home perspective. And there were some measures that we were able to institute to provide some compliance relief, but none of which do anything to undercut health, safety, welfare, and the environment. We revised the corrective action matrix, and Ms. Larson, I may have you speak to this in a little more detail, but this sets the response time that operators are allowed to address rule violations. We added a COVID-19 response time column, and we distributed that to employees on April 15th. Ms. Larson, do you want to speak any further to that?
Certainly. The extensions that are provided in that matrix speak only to administrative matters, meaning we're not providing extensions for compliance for any matter that is related to public health, safety, welfare, and the environment.
Great, thank you. So here's this as well. Does not extend to matters associated with health, safety, welfare, just as Ms. Larson indicated, and it just extends to reporting administrative deadlines. We also issued 3 new notices to operators on May 1 in response to the governor's stay-at-home and safer-at-home orders and other changed circumstances in response to COVID-19. The NTOs, that's the notice to operator, for instance, establishes that it's acceptable to have electronic service and signatures as opposed to mailing documents, which requires someone to go to the office and actually mail something. It extended the approval period for notices of intent to abandon wells, and it delayed sampling, monitoring, or reporting associated with ongoing soil or groundwater remediation projects only in those instances where there was not an immediate threat to public health, safety, welfare, or environmental concerns. So those are the NTOs that we instituted on May 1. I guess I would just conclude, having undertaken this review, it is, my opinion and the opinion of 125 staff that work with me, that we have in place an ability to work under these economic conditions and under the face of the workplace pandemic in a manner that protects public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. Our staff's technical expertise, experience, and coverage throughout the state establish that we can continue forward, and I believe we're a good example of good governance in the face of these challenging situations. So that's the white paper overview. The Readiness white paper FAQs is available on our website, as is the white paper. And at this time, I and staff are available to take questions from commissioners.
Okay, commissioners, I can't see everyone. Did I see a hand maybe from Commissioner Eaton? Is that right?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Director Robbins and staff for this presentation and for pulling this information together for us. I think it's really important, and reassure all of us. Yeah. The work that you're able to continue, that you were doing and that you're continuing to do to assure that. One question that I had, and you talked, Director Robbins, a little bit about the active wells, and that they're, 90% of them are run by the 40 companies. And I guess, and then Mr. Leonard and Mr. Andrews talked about how issues might be healed. I'm just curious if you continue to apply the kind of criteria for distressed operators with 2017, in addition to the things that you mentioned, or failure to report or failure to file notices, whether the sort of distressed operator criteria, which were number of wells owned, delinquency and completing it, and those sorts of things. If you're still monitoring those, if there's any good for that.
Commissioner, excuse me, Director Robbins, this is Mimi Larson. Commissioner Eaton, we were having some difficulty hearing you, and Director Robbins, if you were able to hear her, or okay.
It was tough. Maybe if you could turn your video off, Commissioner Eaton, it might boost up your speed so we can hear you a little bit better. And I apologize.
Yeah, and I apologize too. Just one more item. Commissioner Jolan also joined the meeting about 10:20.
Okay.
Okay, I'll just repeat my question, which was in addition to the, is that better?
Yeah, it's much better. Thank you.
Okay. In addition to the criteria that you're monitoring, and they talked about that reflect, potential issues, and I really appreciated what Mr. Andrews said about that whether you still monitor or look at the kinds of metrics that were used for distressed operators in 2017, which included, the number of wells, the number of shut-in wells that an operator has, delinquent in completing it, and low production.
I'm not sure that I completely understand the question, even though I can hear it completely now, and then I apologize for that. We did have a question from one, I think it was from the environmental letter, that the question was, quote, what is a distressed operator and what are the current projected number of distressed operators? And the FAQ attempts to answer that question. The point, I guess the first point being is that we do not have access to operators' financial information, so we don't really make a determination about distressed or not distressed, but we do monitor all operators' compliance with our rules. And we, you know, as Mr. Leonard noted, we also, you know, keep a sort of thumb check on industry and keep a lookout for bankruptcy filings and news outlets. We make sure that all operators are in compliance with all of our rules, whether they may be in a situation in which they're, you know, not as capable or not. I mean, everyone has to comply with all of our rules and regulations, and we ensure that strict compliance through the monitoring of all the different forms and filings that Mr. Andrews and Mr. Leonard pointed out. Ms. Murphy, did you have a chance to listen in on that, and did you have any answers? Maybe not. We go to the next question.
Mr. Chair, this is Commissioner Putnam.
Please proceed.
Thank you, and thank you, Director Robbins and staff, for the really helpful presentation. I just wanted to flag one other area of continued activity, which is that the Air Pollution Control Division and Water Quality Control Division continue their operations. And with regard to shut-in wells, they are still responsible for compliance with leak detection and repair and other requirements under the Air Quality Control Commission regulations, as well as COGCC regulations. And that activity is continuing, as well as Air Pollution Control Division inspections. As you all know from the conversation that we had with regard to the Occidental settlement last month, we're looking at additional resources to improve some of our remote sensing and kind of landscape level detection of leaks and other sort of things that will help during that time, knowing that potential emissions are one of the areas that we're concerned with, both shut-in and non-shut-in wells, and believe that there are the regulatory tools and improving financial resources to get that done.
Thanks, Commissioner Putnam. Other questions or comments?
Yes, this is Commissioner Hahn.
Commissioner Hahn, please proceed.
Thank you. I too would like to thank the staff for the white paper and the FAQs. First couple questions, Director Robbins, 2 questions, I'll roll into one. There were some concerns that with no public comment, how does this constitute a public meeting? That would be, I'm just interested in sort of the technical aspects of all of this. And secondly, I was just curious as to why the white paper was not released earlier to the public.
Sure, thank you, Commissioner Hahn. First off, many state commissions meet all the time without public comment, and it still is a public meeting. So this has been duly noticed as a public meeting, and it's entirely appropriate that we have it without taking verbal public comment. I did point out at the beginning of my presentation that written public comment to both the white paper and the FAQ are absolutely encouraged, and we look forward to getting that. If there are other questions that the public believes that we've not addressed, we want to address them. And so I ask folks to get written public comment to me, and we will certainly address that. We were hopeful to have had the white paper published by Friday afternoon. Frankly, it was a large work, and I wasn't ready to get it done. I worked over the weekend on the white paper. I worked over the weekend on the FAQ. So because we didn't want to just get something out there, we wanted to get something out there that was right, that was accurate, and that was responsive to the questions we've been receiving. And so the best we could do is get it published this morning.
Thank you. I would like to follow up with a question for Commissioner Hopkins. And I would like to find out what you learned, if you could summarize for us in your Zoom meeting with the Assistant Attorney General Davenport and the Logic Group.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, I'm looking for my notes as opposed to my memory, but my memory is that I was interested in the goals and objectives and answers to the 6-point questions. And basically the feedback I got during that part of the discussion was that they had some questions that they'd like to see answered from the staff in particular, that they thought were very important in looking at the future in context of the COVID pandemic and also the economic downturn. And they really were just looking for some quality information, a responsive response by the staff to it, to try to basically answer the questions as they asked. Their questions were very straightforward. And I noticed as the white paper was prepared, in my opinion, those questions, for the most part, if not totally, were well answered and professionally answered and thoroughly answered. So I think, and I don't want to speak for them, needless to say, but from my perspective and my expectations, let's keep it at that, my expectations, the white paper did provide a very nice, thorough answer to the bulk of the questions that were there. I have a couple of observations later that I'll put on my own behalf, but I hope that answers your question, Commissioner Hahn.
Yeah, I guess maybe at some point we'll just have to hear from, since the questions were answered, it sounds like in the white paper, and I guess with our reading, that does seem to be the case. It would be nice to hear at some point from, that side of the story, how they feel their questions were answered, which of course can't happen today, but at some point it would be nice to know that. And Commissioner Hopkins, if you have some specific insight as to how you think they would respond to the white paper, it would be nice to hear that.
I don't want to speak on their behalf in terms of what they might think about the white paper. I don't know, and I shouldn't speculate. And like I say, I'm looking for the expectations, and I wrote them down. Let me see if I can find them here briefly. Yes, okay. They were concerned, obviously, about distressed operators in the state. We talked about the increased orphan wells. And they had very general concerns that were outlined in those 6 points. They were looking for an objective assessment, a comprehensive assessment in response to the questions, looking at risk, operators walking away, and they're looking forward to an assessment by the staff. And so that's basically set out their expectations that they were hoping to hear. And I'll let them, if they want to respond on their public comments, to give their reaction for you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hopkins. Director Robbins, I thought at one point there was, in a previous study, maybe a couple years ago, or maybe it was under the direction of former Governor Hickenlooper, wasn't there a distress operator list once upon a time? Because you said that you don't have, and I know you don't like to call them distress operators, but that seems to be kind of the term that's being used. I thought at one point in history there was such a list.
Director Robbins,
Yeah,
or maybe Ms. Murphy too could help with that.
Yeah, and I actually was going to defer to Ms. Murphy, who's been around longer than I have. Julie, do you have a comment about that?
I do. So the conversation around orphan wells, distressed operators has been ongoing, I would say, since at least the last downturn in 2014, 2015. And at that point in time, the commission staff were trying to evaluate how to quantify the scope of the problem as part of trying to evaluate what the appropriate solution was. And so we did put together some analysis in response to letters from legislators, where we coined the term distressed operators. And in hindsight, probably not the best decision, but I think it was important to understand the context. We were trying to scope out the problem. But at the end of the day, the commission doesn't have enough information to be able to identify what a distressed operator is, what puts somebody into bankruptcy and what doesn't. We don't have a complete picture. And so it's critically important that we continue to monitor operators, period, without question, without compunction. And that really is where we've shifted. Is it's important to watch what the news says about operators or not, but at the end of the day, even after 2014, 2015, there was not a huge onslaught of orphan wells or bankruptcies that led to, which many people were worried was going to happen at that point in time as well. So again, our focus is monitoring compliance day to day, day in and day out with our rules.
Thank you, Ms. Murphy. Other questions from commissioners?
Chairman Gibbs?
Commissioner Hopkins?
Yes, I don't have questions at this point, but I do have a few observations that I drew from some of the data in the report that you all supplied, which I found very interesting and very enlightening to me anyway. And one was the statistic about the number of operators and the number of wells, and the number of then the fact that 10%, 40 operators control 90% of the active wells. And based on those statistics, those top 40 operators in terms of number of wells have an average of 1,175 wells per operator. So there's a lot of wells associated with those operators, obviously, and per operator, they're going to be very large as well. And then you take the other 381 operators that are in the other 90%, and they have an average of 13 wells per operator. So I think the observation I make there is one, it's one of those 90-10 type of things, which helps, I think, guide priorities and where concerns may be. And while the larger operators have more potential exposure because of the large number of wells that they operate, they also generally, be my speculation, that they have much stronger financial capabilities. And where the smaller ones have less risk exposure because of the much smaller number of wells. 13 wells per operator is not a lot, in my opinion. But they also probably have a little less financial capability. So to me, it was a little bit of insight in just understanding the industry, in particular in context of this issue. The second thing I wanted to mention was that there's a long list of things that when the question to COGCC staff about monitoring operations, ongoing compliance, and indicators that you all look at that might suggest insolvency or other financial challenges, it's a pretty comprehensive list. And I'll just read some of them because I don't think you covered them in much detail in the presentation. But you monitor compliance with your rules, tracks news outlets, bankruptcy filings. You get a sense of their capabilities through failure to report production, file record notices, return information inquiries, follow up on corrective actions noted during inspections. And also operators with a high percentage of long-term shut-in temporary abandoned wells also receive increased monitoring through periodic audit and enacted financial assurance requirements. And I will just say, we've looked at several of the, I know those things that look to be potential challenges in the future, and that list matches very well with some of the recent decisions the commission has had to make as a result of some compliance problems with some of the operators. So I think those red flags are very good, and they're certainly consistent with my experience, limited as it is, with what the commission's activities are. Second thing, and then probably the last thing I'll mention, is on the table, page 3 table. It shows that temporary abandoned wells have increased by about 18% from 1,700, a little over 1,700 to over 2,000 over the first 3 months of 2020. And to me, based on the criteria you've got, that might be an early warning signal that might be worth tracking. So it just to me indicated perhaps an early warning of what may be more to come, just as I looked at some of the numbers, that 18% drop, or I'm sorry, that 18% increase in temporary abandoned wells caught my eye anyway. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Hopkins.
Mr. Chairman Gibbs, if I could have Mr. Leonard speak a little bit about the temporary abandoned well numbers that's from his group.
Sure, Mr. Leonard, whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you. Commissioner Hopkins, when operators are noticing us that they're temporarily abandoned, that's not really necessarily a site that they're, excuse me, that they're having problems. The vast majority of those temporarily abandoned wells, as I kind of glossed over earlier, are the vertical wells that they're no longer producing prior to their plugging of the wells. So an operator may have shut a well in, so let's say 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and now they realize that they're going to go ahead and plug it, but they're just not ready to plug it yet due to various things, the COVID virus, whatever. So they want to temporarily abandon that well and show COGCC that it's safe by plugging off that formation. But they're just not ready to do the full plugging, which is going to cost quite a bit more than just setting that plug and doing a mechanical integrity test. So those that come in that they're telling us they're temporarily abandoned are not necessarily a threat to the state.
And I didn't mean to imply that's really what it is. It just, to me, indicated one of the indicators that you tend to monitor. And the other one that was interesting to me was the plugged and abandoning notices, which dropped off a little bit. And that, to me, it reflects, which I find kind of unfortunate, just from a personal standpoint, since we have active operations in our area. And one of the main benefits from the new the horizontal and horizontal drilling and fracking is that you end up having a lot of legacy wells plugged and abandoned as part of that. And that makes the whole thing safer for our neighborhood. But anyway, I appreciate that feedback, Mike. And that's helpful. But I wasn't trying to imply that it was, other than it was just an indicator that you'd mentioned in your paper that might be worthwhile looking at. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard, and Commissioner Hopkins. Thanks for bringing those issues up. Any other questions or comments? I know once we get through some of these reactions to Director Robbins' presentation, I believe Commissioner Eaton has an item to raise too.
Chairman Gibbs.
Yeah, Commissioner Hahn, please.
I have a question I'd like to direct to Mike Leonard. When wells are shut in, after a 2-year shut-in time period, an MIT is required, I believe. Is there an amount of time that a well can safely be shut in? Because I believe that in the shut-in process, the well remains pressurized so that it could go back into production. So are there stresses on the inner workings of the well that would make it unsafe to be shut in for an extended length of time? Can you explain the engineering behind that, please?
Commissioner Hahn, the answer to that basically is no. That's why we require that after that 2-year period, we require that mechanical integrity test before that well's put back into production, or if it's going to remain shut in. That'll tell us whether the production casing is still adequate. So, wells can be shut in for any length of time. You have to realize, yeah, they do. Some do pressurize a little bit, but you have to remember that most of these wells are the older, for lack of a better word, more depleted wells that aren't going to pressure to a point that causes a mechanical failure.
Commissioner Hahn, are you all right with that answer?
Yes, sorry. I muted because I had a phone ringing in the background. I apologize.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Okay.
So, okay, yes, I am happy with that. So I assume that every 2 years, then that a well is shut in, it would have an MIT performed.
No. So prior to, if a well shut in prior to that 2 year period, the end of that 2 year period from when it originally was shut in, it has to have an MIT performed. Either if it's going to be put back into production or if it's going to remain in the shut-in state. And then by rules, they're required to have MITs every 5 years after that. However, and Dave Andrews can speak to this, we have engineering department has required more frequent and can require more frequent MITs for various shut-in wells.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions or comments?
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Commissioner Boygan, please. And then Commissioner Hopkins after.
I'm happy to defer to Commissioner Hopkins so he can continue the discussion that he's already started.
Thank you, Commissioner Boygan, although I was actually going to talk about something else that had occurred to me earlier, but I didn't cover, and I appreciate this. I read the public comments that came in prior to the white paper and came in at the end of towards after the white paper, and I wanted to comment on some of the industry letters that came in. Especially from the Western Slope and the trades in particular. And the letters were, I thought, a good, thoughtful response to actually what I can also consider to be a very thoughtful set of questions by the environmental health group. But I wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, one of the Western Slope companies, TEP, provided a bit of history in terms of what they saw as their past market and the depressed prices, and then the future. They talked about what they thought the future might show. And I thought that was very helpful to show a bit of sense of how the markets change over time and what their reactions are and what their plans are. So I found that very interesting. And the trade letter closed. I thought it was very helpful as well. And I thought their final closing comment was very constructive in that they implored the staff and the commissioners to work with their associations to make sure that we make our decisions based on facts and not just speculation. And I thought that presented potentially, I thought that was a sincere offer and potentially presented an opportunity, because there is still, I'm sure, even after this presentation, some lingering concerns among the various stakeholders out there. And I was just going to make a request to Director Robbins that he might talk with the trade associations and seeing if they can build a little bit more based on that kind of model that I saw from the Western Slope, about talking about the future expectations, that type of thing that may not be available directly to the COGC otherwise, and that get their perspective on the future and how things might go, and just have a conversation or whatever is the appropriate way to do it. So I just wanted to put that in your thinking process, since I thought they had a very sincere offer there. Thank you.
Chairman Gibbs, just in response, I work hand in hand with the trade associations each week or bi-weekly at a minimum, in which we have discussions with them, and they are representative of the regulated entity that our group regulates, and so we listen to them and get perspective from them often. So thank you, Mr. Hopkins.
Great. Commissioner Boygan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions and a comment or two. First is, to perhaps state the obvious, but maybe it isn't so obvious. It seems to me, looking at the shut-in issue, that actually shutting in wells reduces the risk of compliance issues because by definition, wells are not producing, they're not operating. And so I guess I'd like maybe the director or Mr. Leonard to comment on that, but it does seem to me that any safety or risk to public health, safety, and welfare issues that might exist in sort of a normal oil field operation are actually significantly reduced when wells are shut in. Not to say that that's a desired outcome, because shutting in wells means there's no production, there's no revenue, and a lot of associated negative consequence coming from that. But I guess I'm just concerned that the discussion so far has been focused on potential threats to public health, safety, and welfare from shutting in wells, and I kind of see it from the other standpoint. So maybe if Mr. Leonard and Mr. Robbins could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Commissioner Boygan. I think that one of the reasons that the white paper and the focus was on providing perspective that there's not a threat to a shut-in or a temporarily abandoned or these other sorts of wells is because that was the kind of hypothetical question that was tossed at us, is that somehow or another there were threats from those activities. And I believe you're right. So not only is it not a safety issue to move into one of these categories, but when you are in one of these positions, you're right, a lack of production further makes things safer. Mr. Leonard, do you want to chime in?
Sure, yeah, and I would agree with you, yes, with no product moving beyond the wellbore. I mean, if you look back at our risk study that we did in 2012, 2013, you know, most of the spills and occurrences were through flow lines and tanks, and if those are empty and no product moving through them, there's less of a risk.
Thank you. Just to then continue along these lines, I appreciated Commissioner Hopkins' suggestion about further discussion with the trades, with industry in general. The concern that I have, I've heard sort of from my industry sources about pretty severe stress conditions, refiners and midstream transporters maybe curtailing the taking of production. Producers may be faced with situations that they think amount to force majeure occurrences that prevent them from marketing their production. Certainly prices have been so low, and the DJ has a significant negative differential, let's say, to prices that can be obtained in the Permian. DJ is going to be probably affected disproportionately by the current commodity price environment. And all of this is putting operators under stress. They're, as I understand it, they're shutting in not just the old legacy vertical wells, but recently drilled horizontal wells because they can't produce them economically. They even can't produce at all because production can't be marketed. I'm not sure about that. And there also are not completing wells that were previously drilled, called in the trade DUCs, DUCs, drilled and uncompleted wells, which of course means that the investment has been made, but there's no ability to monetize that investment because you can't complete the wells economically and produce them. So I guess I'm asking whether the staff has looked at it or could look at ways to address these concerns. I know that commissions in other states are doing that. Texas had a 10-hour hearing, the Texas Railroad Commission recently, on a request by a few major operators for the Railroad Commission actually to limit production, which it has the statutory authority to do. And as you've already noted, Director Robbins, you don't have that authority here in Colorado. But the point is, there was a lot of dialogue around the issue of what to do to respond to these extreme conditions, which are putting industry under high stress. And I think the Oklahoma Corporation Commission may have even issued some sort of order permitting the shutting in of wells, and I'm not sure how that works under their statute and what implications it has. But I'm suggesting that there may be measures that this commission ought to be looking at that can help to relieve some of the stress conditions that industry finds itself in. And I don't expect you to have any concrete response to that now, but I would suggest that it would be useful to at least begin that dialogue with industry.
Thank you, Commissioner Boygan. This is Director Robbins. Yes, I think that we are ready, willing, and able to evaluate those sorts of questions. The simple fact of the matter is that we've not heard from the trades or industry that additional measures are necessary at this point. But if and when we hear that additional measures, for instance, Oklahoma may have done an order with regard to allowing shut-in wells. Well, we allow shut-in wells now, so there's not a need to do an order. I had, another industry had asked the question, can you reduce the fees for shutting in wells? Well, we don't have fees for shutting in wells. New Mexico may have, but that we don't. And so part of today's process was somewhat educational for everyone so that everyone could understand the framework that exists now under these circumstances. But if there are needs to adjust that framework, we'll certainly look at that and bring those questions and needs back to the commission as necessary.
Director Gibbs?
Yeah, Commissioner Overturf, please.
Thank you. So I wanted to say that I really appreciate Commissioner Boygan's comments. I've been reading similar things, and I think what they did in Oklahoma was actually changing a rule about your ability to retain a lease even if you're not producing for a set amount of time. That's my understanding of what's been occurring in Oklahoma. But I've also been following this very closely, and I think our country and our state and this industry in particular are facing what I think are unprecedented challenges. And I really want to thank staff for taking the time to prepare the white paper and to respond to questions that were posed both by stakeholders and by commissioners who are trying to really just proactively think about this uncertain world that's ahead of us. And I wanted to just also follow up similar to Commissioner Hopkins, although we may have had a different interpretation, but I also read all of the public comments that were filed with us in advance of today's meeting, and I have to say that I was frankly surprised to see some comments that seemed to imply that it was somehow improper or unnecessary for this commission to be asking questions of staff and stakeholders about how these unprecedented challenges are going to be impacting the COGCC's goals of protecting health, safety, and the environment. And some, I thought, strongly implied that this commission posing questions of staff indicated that we are either ill-intentioned, ill-informed, or both. And so I want to state really clearly that I think it's entirely appropriate for this commission to be seeking information and for us to have public conversations about these unprecedented times and how they may be impacting this industry and impacting the state. I think this provides really necessary transparency to the public for us to have this information out and available for anyone who's interested and to be having this conversation. And I think it shows that we're executing on our responsibility to be thinking proactively about these types of emerging issues. So I really appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion, and I appreciate the work that staff has done. I'd also like to encourage staff to continue its good work of conducting its inspections and monitoring operators for emerging risks, including ensuring that these required mechanical integrity tests are being timely completed. I know that that has been a focus of enforcement staff in the past, and I anticipate that it will continue to be a focus. And also for preparing for a possible surge of orphan wells that may arise in the future. I don't think it's imminent, but I think if it does occur that we see a lot of operators having real troubles with these challenging financial times, that it certainly could emerge as an even larger issue in the coming year or two, long after this volunteer commission is no longer sitting in these seats. So I guess to that end, I also had a question, because I think when we think about how these circumstances might be impacting the number of orphaned and abandoned wells that the state does have to deal with, I think the primary tool or mechanism that this commission has to deal with that existing and potentially increasing threat is around financial assurance. And I know that a financial assurance rulemaking was one of the priorities that the legislature identified for this commission in the passage of Senate Bill 181. And so I was wondering, Director Robbins, if you had any update on the timing around the financial assurance rulemaking for the professional commission, whether you could provide any update about when you're thinking that rulemaking may be undertaken, because it is, I think, even more, I've long thought that it was incredibly important and one of the most important things Senate Bill 181 did, and I think it's even more important today.
Yeah, the white paper on page 8 speaks to this a bit, Commissioner Overturf. We had received questions regarding the adequacy of current levels of financial assurance, and if in fact there could be a large number of wells that are abandoned. The fact of the matter is that we were working quite well toward meeting our mandate of getting the 4 primary rulemakings done up until we ran into COVID-19. And that is still the priority that we were tasked with from the legislature, is to finish up. We've got flow lines done, but we still need to do mission change, alternative location, and cumulative impacts. And that's going to be taken up by the professional commission, as you well know. The financial assurances is, next on the list. The other thing that I wanted this commission, and I guess folks, to understand is that I and staff have recently analyzed the current financial assurance protocol. And we did that with an eye toward, is there anything further that we could do in a more immediate manner that would better the financial assurance environment that we have? And frankly, having looked at that, we did not identify any measures that could be implemented immediately that would create a better financial insurance interim environment. But we did think about that, and we did look at that, and we decided that it's, sort of stay the course and take up financial assurance after we've done the 4 identified rulemakings from the legislature. So I appreciate the question, and it is somewhat answered on page 8 of the white paper.
Thank you, Director Robbins. I turned my video off because my internet seems a little shaky right now.
That Commissioner Boygan is asking to speak.
Okay, Commissioner Boygan.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick observations. First, I didn't read the industry submittals the same way Commissioner Overturf did, and I'm sorry she took that interpretation from them. I don't think that's what was intended. I read them to be saying that they believe that they are being responsible, and that industry by and large does understand and accept and perform its responsibilities, and that industry is ready, willing, and able to continue to work with regulators to ensure that that's the case. I didn't see a confrontation or a challenge in those letters, so maybe we just have a different perspective on that. The other thing I would offer is that there is a provision in the rules for increasing the bonding for inactive wells to an amount that admittedly is still not adequate to cover the full cost of plugging a well. And there is a time period that has to elapse before a well is considered to be inactive. I believe for a shut-in well, it's a year that a well has to be shut in before the bonding has to be increased, although I think there's some discretion perhaps on the part of the director to require some enhanced bonding in certain circumstances. But I agree with Commissioner Overturf that taking a hard look at the financial assurance provisions is critical. It's too bad that we're not going to be able to get to that. I'm confident that the next commission will make it a priority. But it's, you know, right now my understanding is we have what, $9 million in the Environmental Response Fund, which is funded by industry, and so far it seems to be adequate to address the current scope of the problem. But if the problem magnifies because of current conditions, then obviously it could become an issue, and I'm not disputing that. I'm hoping it's not the case. I mean, after all, wells are the source of revenue for operators, so the last thing they want to do is shut them in if they can produce them and generate funds to continue to carry on their operations. So shutting in wells, walking away from wells, that's it's a sign of such desperation and of such distress that hopefully it's a minimal occurrence. So that's all I really have to say. Thank you.
And if I can, this is Director Robbins. I would again, and so I had to obviously summarize the white paper, so I didn't get to go into reading the whole thing. That would have bored everybody to death. But the point you make, Commissioner Boygan, is actually emphasized on page 8 of the white paper. And you talk about the COGCC's ability to increase bonding in certain instances around inactive wells. And I would point out that we have a sentence there: as a result of these inactive well reviews, the COGCC has secured additional bonding in excess of $90 million over the last 5 years. And that's an example of the COGCC's monitoring operators' ongoing compliance, et cetera. So I thank you for bringing that to our attention. It is contained within the white paper, and it is a tool that, you know, previous to my time, we've been using effectively. Chairman Gibbs, since you have your video off to preserve bandwidth, I'm just looking to see if we have other questions. If any, Commissioner, Ms. Hahn.
Yeah, Commissioner Hahn is next. Yeah.
So I appreciate Commissioner Boygan's initial comments, because it was right down the lines of the next thing I wanted to inquire about. So the standards for shutting in wells and plugging and abandoning seems fairly straightforward and generally safe. I think it was just good for us to hear the overview and go over that kind of step by step. But I think one of my greatest concerns is what we're talking about now, the economics. And if we start to see more orphaned wells, which it's likely we'll see an increase. So I believe there's over $9 million in the Orphan Well Fund, and it's $35,000 to plug a well, and that's without reclamation, et cetera. And so I don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but so with what is in the Orphan Fund now, that would be enough to just take care of those wells that are abandoned, I believe, without any other reclamation work. With that $90 million in bonding, so can that $90 million be used for any of those expenses, Director Robbins?
Yeah, I would maybe turn this back over to Mr. Andrews, our engineering manager, who is in charge of the Orphan Well program under the engineering protocol. Dave, are you still on, and are you unmuted?
Yes, thank you. So the $9 million, and I'm not exactly sure if you're looking at a budget sheet or what may be available over time, but keep in mind that our budget is set by the legislature in the long bill every year. So for fiscal year 1920, that was about $5 million. And then we had some carryover from our appropriation from last year because we have 2-year spending authority. So when that was first established around the $5 million mark, I believe it was the legislature's intent to continue to look at the amount funded to the program every year. So I guess I'm not exactly clear on what you mean by the $9 million.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't write down exactly where I did a lot of reading and made a lot of notes, and I don't remember exactly where I saw the $9 million figure, but somewhere I read that there was in excess of $9 million in the Orphan Well Fund. Is that not correct?
If anyone from our, I guess, finance portion of management is on the call, they might be better equipped to answer that question. But what I can tell you is for this fiscal year, the budget was $5 million.
Director or Chair, may I?
Go ahead, Ms. Murphy.
Yeah, please.
Thanks. Commissioner Hahn and Commissioner Boygan, based on rolling forward spending authority, there was approximately, I think, $8.7 million available or authorized by the legislature for COGCC to spend on the Orphan Well program. The executive order that Hickenlooper executed at the end of his governorship contemplated COGCC budgeting and spending approximately $5 million per year over the course of 5 years or more as needed to reduce Orphan Well backlog. That was a great vision, but it took us a little while to get that program up and running. So about $3.7 million from that first year of spending authority, we weren't able to spend as Dave was in the process of hiring people, building the program out, and getting ready to launch. And so as that unspent money rolled into year 2, that's what gave us almost $9 million to spend in the following year. And so that's been a large part of the conversation before the Joint Budget Committee this session. And it's part of why COGCC has been engaged in that conversation, is making sure we have the right spending authority for the program that matches what our staffing resources are. And we think as staff today, we can spend approximately $5 million a year, which is what the executive order contemplated and what we've been doing year over year at this point in time. So I think if that helps answer the gap between where is the approximate 9, why are we only spending 5, it takes time and attention to appropriately issue contracts, prioritize Orphan Well locations, and then monitor the completion of that work. And so that's what Dave's Orphan Well team has been doing and is doing. And we think we can continue spending about $5 million a year to do that work.
So if we look at the 275 that are on the chart that are abandoned, considered abandoned now, on page 7, I believe. And if it's $35,000 a well, that's 9.6 million. And so I go back to big concern with the economics, and I realize not all of those wells will be plugged within a year, but I'm concerned with the backlog of potential orphan wells, and $5 million a year is just not going to be enough if we look at simply plugging what's considered abandoned now, and we're over $9.6 million. So I'm just trying to understand the economics.
And so, Commissioner Hahn, I think that Ms. Murphy is correct in that the commission at this point only has so much capacity in terms of what it can get done year over year. Some of that is based upon our staff. Frankly, some of that is based upon the fact that in order to plug and abandon a well, we have to go through state procurement, and that takes some time. And so there's, we're doing, I think, the capacity that we can do at this point in time. That 275 number, we continue to prioritize, and I see Dave's now back up and running, so Dave can help me with this, but he prioritizes those orphan wells, and we go after the projects that are on the high priority list. each year. And, frankly, I think we're doing a good job with the resources and the money that we have. I don't know if you follow, but the Joint Budget Committee recently decided that we should not have $5 million in the proposed long bill next year. And so it's going to be less. So there's a lot of balancing that's going on here at state government in terms of trying to make sure that we are doing all the things that we're statutorily supposed to be doing. And I think we're doing it fairly well. Mr. Andrews, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Director Robbins, just I guess to outline a little bit more about the history that Ms. Murphy mentioned. So in 2018, when Governor Hickenlooper's order came out for the program, based on the backlog that we had in the program at that time, the goal was to try and reduce those sites down to 0 for medium and high priority over 5 years. So that meant about $5 million per year. So even looking back to 2018, the thought was, somewhere around $25 million on the program just to deal with what was in the backlog at the time. Obviously, over the last couple of years and moving forward, we will have more additions to the program. So my understanding is when the legislature first contemplated this, they kind of left it open to continue funding the program annually at an appropriate rate, until we're entirely through the backlog.
All right.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Director Gibbs?
Yeah, Commissioner Overturf.
This isn't a question just so much as first to just say I really appreciate having this conversation. And I was thinking back this morning to the very first COGCC meeting that I attended back in 2017, which was in Meeker, and there was a presentation by Mr. Anderson about this topic. And so I've been hearing about the Orphan and Abandoned Wells program for the entire time that I've been on the COGCC, and definitely appreciate how much work I know Mr. Anderson has done in getting that program up and running. And I know this is not necessarily a decision that can be made by anyone that's on this call. Director Robbins, I know that you're not superhuman, but I would just like to put it out into the internet, I guess, that I do hope that when the legislature is kind of evaluating and doing some of these really difficult trade-offs with funding and the financial situation that we're in, to really give a strong look at continuing to fund this Orphaned and Abandoned Wells program. It is so incredibly important, and it's also creating jobs for field workers in this industry who may not have as many opportunities in other sectors of the industry. So just want to highlight that I think continuing to fund this, and if the state receives any stimulus money that's specifically focused on the oil and gas industry, to try to use any of that money to the extent we can to continue funding the Orphan and Abandoned Wells program, just that I think it's so incredibly critical.
Chairman Gibbs, this is Director Robbins, if I could respond.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I just want to, I appreciate having this discussion as well. And, we're definitely in trying times. We've, part of the response to this was to address COVID-19. Part of this is to address low commodity prices. Part of this is to address the budget issues that the state is ongoing. At the end of the day, I just want to inform the commission that from my perspective and my staff's perspective, we are using our budget wisely. There's not going to be a need to plug every temporarily abandoned well. And I just want to quell the notion that this downturn equates to some sort of environmental issue with more orphaned wells. It's just simply, and from my perspective, not the case. And we feel confident with my management team and the professional staff that I have that we will be able to, as I concluded in the white paper, continue to regulate this industry in a manner that's protective. We're going to, be nimble, and we're going to work with operators, and we're going to ensure that as wells move into a shut-in capacity or a temporarily abandoned capacity, all the rules and regulations that are in place will ensure safety, safety first. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you, Director Robbins. Great questions, for sure. Other comments or questions? Please just speak up, because it's hard to see everyone. If there are no questions or comments regarding Director Robbins's presentation, we can also offer up this opportunity to raise any additional questions or issues that we should raise while this meeting is still going on. Commissioner Eaton?
Yeah, thank you. I really wanted to thank everybody for doing this meeting. I wanted to raise an issue that I think is important for this commission to be thinking about, and one that we have the opportunity potentially over the remainder of our time on the commission to address, and that is to begin to think about and learn more about environmental justice and disproportionately impacted communities and underrepresented communities in our process. And I've been having some discussions with people at CDPHE and elsewhere who are looking at those issues and developing policies to address and to identify communities that may be disproportionately impacted by environmental decisions. And I guess I wanted to propose and discuss with fellow commissioners the idea of potentially doing a briefing for this commission that would just lay out and identify some issues with environmental justice and disproportionately impacted communities, and look at how different people and agencies are addressing those concerns in their processes. So, and I would propose that we do a special hearing like this that would just be focused on that kind of a briefing.
Commissioner Eaton, I just have a follow-up. Is this something you anticipate that COGCC staff would help lead, or is that something that you would bring in, supplemental speakers to help educate folks on issues at hand? And I just want to get a sense of what this means for potential staff time and whether or not we have the capability, I guess, right now. And that'd be a question for Director Robbins.
So that's a really good question. My expectation was that we would bring in, and I certainly can help and provide resources to pull this together, but bring in experts from outside of COGCC. And I don't think it makes sense for COGCC staff to try to prepare a briefing themselves. So yeah, my expectation was that we would bring in experts from outside and that could assist in pulling together that kind of a briefing.
Yeah, and I guess another follow-up, maybe for Mr. Davenport, but maybe Mr. Davenport, is this something that can be separate from OGCC hearings, that it's like a supplemental education for commissioners, or would this have to be kind of run just like this meeting,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There are some things that anytime the commission gets together have to be done to comply with open meetings law and various other APA provisions. I think it would have to be done generally like this meeting in terms of notice, and it would need to be in public, those kind of things. Was that your question?
Yeah, I guess I just wondered, is this something that, Commissioner Eaton could almost facilitate independently of this, or I guess if we are all together, it has to be obviously noticed in a public meeting. So Commissioner Eaton, you would facilitate the right people on presentations, and then we would have, like a special meeting like this, I guess. I just wanted to make sure I understand things correctly.
I mean, that is my proposal, and working with any other commissioners or staff to prepare the panels and the presenters.
Mr. Chair, this is Kyle Davenport again.
Yeah, Mr. Davenport, please.
So I think one of the things we're going to have to look at before we go any further with this is the fact that environmental justice is part of the noticed draft rules, and how that plays into this commission's ability to have hearings about something that's part of a noticed draft rule. It does gives me some pause as to whether or not we're able to do it. And so I'm going to need to look further into that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very briefly, CDPHE has been looking at this issue very closely for purposes of actually all of our programs, but especially some of the greenhouse gas planning elements where House Bill 1261 explicitly directed us to have heightened outreach to impacted communities. And so we've been doing some of that work, working with a number of stakeholders on that, collecting a lot of the data that we have that we incorporate into a number of our environmental justice and health equity activities. It is incredibly important to us, and I think to the state overall, and so we would be happy to contribute resources and experts on that subject. I do have the question of, given that it is part of the mission change rulemaking, and given our current schedule, does it make sense to do that now versus when the permanent commission is seated, since they're the ones who are going to be making a lot of those calls that will have the most important implications. I can certainly offer in the meantime to have staff-to-staff briefings on kind of where we're going. And I know we've had some conversations already on environmental justice issues, and we can make sure we have that to talk about process as well as substance on that front. But it is important, and CDPHE is prepared to assist.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you.
Other thoughts on this? And I know Mr. Davenport is looking into the legal issues. So I don't necessarily think we can make a decision this second. Anything else on this? So I think it's safe to say, Mr. Davenport, you'll look into this request by Commissioner Eaton to see
Yes.
if there are any legal ramifications, and then you'll report back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I will.
Okay. Great. That sounds good.
Yeah, then I really appreciate that, and hope that we can get that response and think about what we can do during the remainder of our term here and to advance this issue. So thank you, and thank you, Commissioner Putnam, for your offer of support from CDPHE.
Okay, well, thank you. Any other issues that commissioners would want to raise before we adjourn this meeting? Just, again, I can't see everyone, so just speak up if you need to. If there are no more comments or questions, we need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
That motion's been made to adjourn. Any further comments? Seeing none. All those in favor to adjourn, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, say no. The ayes have it. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, commissioners, and thanks for we had a big group, almost 300 people call in today for this meeting. So thanks for all the folks that have that called in.
And it's good to see Commissioner Jolan.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Great to see all of you.